Let's start with Remembrance Sunday. Philip, what are your thoughts today? This really special day. We do it once a year. The 11th of November is, of course, tomorrow. That is Armistice Day itself. But Remembrance Sunday, where everything is obviously concentrated, we remember on both days. But what are your thoughts today?
It's such an important day because it speaks to our very identity as a culture. It's one of those moments, I say a moment, it's a couple of days, but it's one of those moments that brings past, present and future together. It allows us to have that space to think about who we are and where we've been and where we're going. I think it's very important for this day for it to be removed from the cut and thrust of politics, especially from any kind of protest or any kind of cheap politicking, because it really is something that we literally stop and we think about the people who we've lost, and it's a very human and important thing to do, because ultimately it's about sacrifice. And if you have any kind of society or civilization that's worth anything, then sacrifice, the right kind of sacrifice for good, is incredibly important, and we must never forget. I think one of the dangers we have of living in a society which is almost completely online for many people and a fast moving news feed is that we only think about the now, the present. We don't really think about the future, or we don't think about it in a serious way. We think about it in catastrophic ways like climate change, etc. But we don't think about what makes us us. And this particular moment, as I say, is so important for that, because it allows us that space to think. And one of the things we really don't have is space these days.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Space to think and consider what we are as a nation and where we're going. It's a really, really good point. If you're watching on screen, you will see that we've got the live feed now from the cenotaph that has come up, and we will keep that on screen for most of the next hour, certainly, and absolutely, of course, during the 2-minute silence and around that time as well. Philip made some really good points there, Maxwell. I wonder what your thoughts are this morning on Remembrance Sunday.
Well, when I was coming into the studio this morning, I was on the tube coming in, and I saw veterans and their families there. I think, to point out, with Philip here, it's not just about those who have previously served, but also the families who are still here and still affected by those veterans. And I think it's an interesting cross-generational divide we have now. The world is very, yes, there's lots of wars going on, but the West is very peaceful. And I think, given how online everything is, war is always in their face. And I think for them, being able to interact with those veterans face to face and to take part in that period of reflection, I think is so important. And I just think it's just to come on to the protest point. I'm sure we'll come on to it. I think it's good if we do have protest here, because it shows exactly who is willing to interrupt and disrupt that period of unity, that very British period. I mean, it's 110 years since the start of the First World War, when all of this kicked off. And I really do think it's important to see who stands with us and who stands against us. I think that is a very important dividing line that I think we should treasure in a liberal democracy. As you said, Peter, this show wouldn't exist. Our lives would not be the same if we didn't defeat fascism, if we didn't defeat communism, if we didn't defeat those radicals throughout the world who seeks to destroy what is such a great thing, that being Western civilization and liberal democracy.
The quotation from Winston Churchill, appropriate today, comes to mind. I think he might have been quoting Victor Hugo at the time, but he said, "You have enemies, good. That means you've stood up for something sometime in your life." I wonder if, as we talk about not just reflecting on what we'll be doing ourselves in about 45 minutes' time, just over that, Philip, there are those who would disrupt. I don't think they're going to get very far today. There is reporting that there are attempts, certainly, to disrupt Remembrance events tomorrow, Philip, from various groupings. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I don't think we need to have groups interrupting Remembrance Sunday to know who they are. We know very well. are. We don't need them to do that. Okay, so this is a space, and it's ultimately about decency and respect. We're not in a period of peace. The West is in absolute turmoil as well. Okay, philosophical turmoil and emotional turmoil. You only have to look at what happened with the Trump election this week and some of the responses to that. We are in a mental health crisis, which speaks of turmoil. It is a kind of war. It's a very modern kind of war. But in terms of the disruption, we have this Palestinian direct action group.
It's having training days for its activists. We also know that a Just Stop Oil supporter has been arrested after it was the Daily Express actually was writing about the Remembrance Day chaos that was being planned by some Just Stop Oil people as well. So Philip, we know there are those who would disrupt even the most solemn of ceremonies, and that to me just smacks of, look, if you're going to make your point at an appropriate time. But to disrupt something like this, which, as you say, is a major point of unity for so many people, well, it just speaks volumes, I think, about what these people's motivations.
Yeah, and I don't think this is really about disruption. I think that's putting it extremely kindly. They are talking in terms of cells. They are talking in terms of destruction. One of the memos said, take your crazy ideas and do what you want with them. We're about destroying our adversity. So this is about terrorism, and we have to treat it as such. It's also internal as well. And if I think about Palestinian action, I can't help but think about anti-Semitism. And I think the difference we have now is that anti-Semitism used to be outside of the establishment, outside of the institutions. It used to be, a few knuckle-dragging National Front members in the 1970s who would go out for a punch-up in a pub. Now I call them the Ponsonby Smythes. Now it's privately educated young people who are cosplaying at terrorism and using events like Remembrance Sunday and Remembrance Day as stages for their performativity. So that isn't to downplay the seriousness of what's going on here when I say it's cosplay, because it's extremely serious.
Yeah.
But it's often from within. It's often from the most privileged members of our society, and we treat it with the seriousness it deserves.
Well, you're right, Philip, and actually, Maxwell, this is a point, isn't it? That there are those people, the Ponsonby Smythes, that Philip correctly identifies there, who wouldn't dream of using the N-word, who wouldn't dream of criticising someone for being LGBT or whatever, but somehow anti-Semitism is okay.
Of course, because they see it essentially as a righteous cause. I find it baffling when you look at the world stage. There is a genocide in Darfur, there's a genocide in Cambodia, there's a genocide in China, and yet, the only area where these Ponsonby Smythes, as we call them, come out to protest and come out to try and destroy and ruin, a long-held ceremony, that being Remembrance Sunday, will be over this Israel-Palestine conflict. And I think it just speaks so much, I think, to sort of selfishness, I think, of a lot of the new generation who are so wrapped up in their own beliefs and wanting to, virtue signal and show off how woke they are in many ways. In order to do so, they must seek to completely desecrate what is essentially a very holy day in the British calendar, not just political, but cultural, social, historical. So I think it is, I'm with Peter on this. These should be prescribed organisations if they're willing to go about and use terror to disrupt and to show off their own political thinking.
Thank you to Amanda, who's been in touch. She says, good morning, Peter. Regarding Remembrance and the young, I was so delighted when I heard that my 3-year-old grandson had come home from nursery bursting with pride. He had learned all about the brave shoulders, he called them, and made a big red poppy. Well done to that little nursery school for speaking about this in an age-appropriate way, says Amanda. Bill in Cheshire says, Remembrance Day, when politicians are at the cenotaph later for their annual photo opportunity to look sad, they need to be reminded that actions speak louder than words, so increase defence spending, look after veterans, and stop wasting money on areas which the public don't care about. Stop waffling and do something. Thank you to Don Chelmsford as well, who says my grandfather, Don in Chelmsford I should say, who says my grandfather Harry was a lad in the Navy in World War I on a battleship at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. He was then a reservist and called back in 1939 to serve in a destroyer through World War II. We remember him today, of course. Thank you to Mary in County Down, who says Remembrance Sunday and Armistice Day are really important reminders of the sacrifice and service of those in the armed forces, past and present, but we also need a greater focus on the horrors and often futility of war. Today people will be remembering British soldiers who died in Afghanistan, yet that country is now back in the evil grip of the Taliban, and people there, particularly women, are leading absolutely terrible lives. What did our soldiers fight and die for? We salute their bravery, but today we must also focus on the outcome of the wars we wage. It's a really good point there, Philip, from Mary, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. I think it's so rich. It's so it's such an important part of our culture that not only do we need to participate in it, we also need to think about it as well, and we need to map it on, as Mary says there, to our own actions, I think. And this is about, as Maxwell says, this is about family, this is about who we are and what we're doing, and essentially where we're going.
Yeah, absolutely. Final word from Maxwell on this.
I mean, this is a very solemn day, but it's a day, I think, to look forward and to kind of unite and to see what it is as a country we really do value. And I think after the turmoil of the last few years, you know, from 2016 onwards, essentially, I think we now need to start coming together and to think about what it is that matters to the British people.
Barry in the Ards Peninsula, I have a lump in my throat from your message, which is an incredibly kind thing to send through. Barry in the Ards Peninsula has messaged in. I'm a little bit choked up here, actually. He says, "Morning, Peter. In memory of Sergeant Robert Charles McLaren, who was aged 20, 626 Squadron, RAF Volunteer Reserve, killed in action on the 14th of January 1944, and to the 55572 of his 55,572 of his comrades who also lost their lives when the day breaks." Barry in the Ards Peninsula, that is my grandfather's brother that he has mentioned, and I know that Barry has done that deliberately in a very, very kind thing to remember today. And Barry, I'm really touched by that. Thank you. We'll be back after the break.